The point of the panel is ultimately, it's a bit like Prime Minister's question time. This is your chance to be as honest as you wish. Des has very kindly come in this afternoon. If you've got more technical questions and so on, I think that was something particularly that Des was going to be able to help with. Ultimately, the floor is yours. If you put your hand up and ask a question, you never know, there might be a little bit of alcohol for you. So don't be shy. But I do have questions anyway if people are struggling, but I'd rather get questions from the floor. The lovely ladies in pink and in black, I think Benita's in, will bring microphones around to you so you don't have to shout. But please speak clearly so that we can hear your questions. And then it will be given to the floor. So I'm going to start before we ask the questions, just to have a very quick overview from the gentlemen who are with me, just in terms of who they are, particularly, obviously, the likes of Des, who you haven't seen so far.
Thank you very much. I'm Des Ward. I'm the President of the UK and Ireland chapter of the Cloud Security Alliance. Our role within International is about looking at information risk management within the cloud. We're not just looking at the technological aspects of cloud, but we're looking at this holistic thing that seems to be often overlooked when we come to cloud. We've talked about security, which I believe now is an outdated concept. So hopefully we can discuss some of this in this session now.
Thanks, Des. Good afternoon to you. My name is Paul Reynolds. I work for Webroot. I'm responsible for our UK business. I welcome your questions this afternoon. Been involved in cloud computing and SaaS for around 7 years. And as a vendor, I have some great experience and exposure to customer pain and questions. By all means, any questions you have, welcome to answer.
I'm Bob Griffin from RSA. I'm a technical strategist there. I've been at RSA 10 years and in the industry for about 30. Was also responsible for 2 of our cloud deployments, our HR deployment and also some technical deployments related to key management.
And I'm Steve Plank from Microsoft. Everybody calls me Planky. I'm a cloud evangelist for the company in the UK, and my kind of background is really around security and architecture.
Hi, my name is Kim Castro. I'm from K4 Innovation. My question is open to the panel with regards to a standard, an international standard, possibly being formed, because based on the presentations we saw this morning, we've seen a number of different things coming about, and it looks like it's fragmenting already, with CSA, NIST, we've got BSI, INISA, Jericho, and the last one was Industry Forum. Do you guys have anything in terms of them working together with regards to creating an international standard?
I'll take this one, but under a slightly different hat. I currently am the head of framework development for the Common Assurance Maturity Model, which is a CSA-supported initiative, but is also supported by the ISF, by ISO, BITS, ISACA, ISSA, etc., and a number of organisations that, as we go through our alpha and beta programs, will become known publicly. Essentially, we are looking, and we have been working for the last 2 years with not just cloud vendors, but the entire supply chain, to actually look at consolidating the current raft of different assurance frameworks that are out there at the present minute in time, make them meaningful, not just on or off, or have you got to work out the scope. That's currently going through an alpha pilot at this present minute in time. Anybody who wants to talk to me about it, we'll talk about it offline. But it's also led to something called the Third Party Assurance Centre, which again is backed by PCI, BITS, CSA, etc. And that, in the interim, will allow any external service provider, not just cloud, to put up their audit results and share them securely with their current and prospective clients. So things are going to change. It's just going to take a little bit of time, but there is a halfway house in between the two.
So part of my role at RSA actually is to drive standards as well, both at the personal level. I'm the co-chair of the key management standard for OASIS, and also at the strategy level for the company. Standards is a difficult question because they're so good, we have so many of them, right? And in the area of cloud, there really are 3 very different kinds of standards that we're working on. One of them is with CSA. We have the editor for the CSA guidance is from RSA. And we see that both the cloud audit guidance the definition of controls and also the threat landscape as something that really is effectively being done by CSA. The second big area are frameworks that allow you to establish effective models for security, both in the enterprise and across the cloud. So things like ISO 27000, for example, are hugely important in that area. There are a number of models. We ourselves at EMC use ISO 27000 and fully expect that the work we're doing with them to build that out farther in terms of new kinds of controls related to cloud and virtualization will continue to make that one really, I think, the leadership framework model. And then the third big area are technical standards that allow implementation of interoperability, for example. And there are still some critical areas there that really need development. For example, the DMTF has a standard that relates to the format of virtual images. That standard open virtualization format really still requires some important work regarding unique identification of virtual images. There's still work to be done in the standard that I lead around ways to move encryption keys securely across cloud environments. So there are actually very important standards at the technical level that go beyond what we have at the moment. And I would fully expect that there'll be very important standards that you'll see over the next 2 years in that area that really will enable interoperability across the cloud in ways that is not really possible at the moment.
Yeah, just really briefly, I was listening to a talk given by our Chief Security Architect on the subject of standards, and he said something really interesting, which is to define cloud computing as one big amorphous mass is really it's kind of an inaccuracy, because there are so many types of computing that take place in this thing that we call the cloud. It's a little bit like saying there should be some kind of standard certification for transport. Well, transport includes flying, it includes going through the sea and rivers, and it includes public transport, and it includes private transport like us in our cars. And to try and get a standard which would cover all of those things adequately just means that you'll probably never get the standard out the door. And so that's why Microsoft's working very closely in each of its areas with the standards bodies and the other organizations that are involved in that, in targeting what is an appropriate standard for the type of computing within this big thing that we call the cloud to adhere to.
Another question? Okay, I have a question. So, one of the things that has come up is, as the cloud grows and evolves, how are the security threats it faces changing?
Well, I think first of all, we have to remember that whilst there's an awful lot of things being made about security in the cloud, we actually forget that it's managing risks to information. I think part of the issue that we have at the present moment in time with the computing landscape is that organisations actually see their IT departments as being a black art. Their data's held in there, they don't know what's in there, and over the last 10, 15 years, it's grown into a large clump that they have very little visibility into. All of a sudden, you have this thing called the cloud, this large mass, as has been talked about, has really focused questions that really should have been asked during outsourcing, that should have been asked when there was data centres, before we called the likes of ArcSpace a cloud vendor. It's only all of a sudden now we're getting a lot of issues arising that are no more than information being held by an organisation and what controls, after conducting a risk assessment, does that organisation require. That's something that isn't available just now to a lot of these external service providers. That's driving a lot of the reliance on outdated assurance frameworks. I don't think that it's so much that the security threat is changing, but I do believe that the current businesses and client organisations need to evolve to get the best out of cloud computing in a safe manner.
So this is an area that is extremely important for RSA because we actually were hit by what's called an advanced persistent threat back in March. And both at the professional level and personal level, I think there is indeed a watershed in the landscape of threats that we're facing. characterized by two most important things. The first of those is the kind of attack that we're seeing, which is a complex, multifaceted attack. In RSA's case, for example, the initial attack was through an email, a social engineering attack with phishing that was intended not to get credentials for the user. It wasn't one of those Nigerian messages, right? It was against one of our HR folks, intended to get malware loaded onto their system, which could then act as a bootstrap for loading very much more sophisticated malware into our server environment. That model is really different from what we saw 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, where most often it was a single model, a single area of attack. This is quite complex attacks. The second really important thing is that the attacks are now commercialized. There is a huge underground economy in development of malware and in the monetization of stolen information and credentials. We ourselves at RSA, but also Microsoft and other folks, are very active in penetrating that underground economy to find out what are the threats that are being waged against the industry. And that means that there really is a financial incentive to attacks that even, I think, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, certainly when I first started, probably no one else here remembers, but the first virus I saw was a Christmas tree virus, right, which just put up a Christmas tree on your monitor. So that's not the virus anymore. These are really attacks intended to pull information out of your environment. And the implication, I think, for us in terms of models in which you entrust information outside of your enterprise boundaries to a third party means that you have to be extremely careful about your visibility into that environment. Issues around what will they allow you in terms of seeing what's going on in their environment. The more that you can be confident you know what protections they put in place, what they're doing to detect and clean systems, the more confident you can be about what you entrust to their environments. So I think that, from our point of view, is by far the most important implication. That tools like Webroot, for example, that actually give you the ability to look in detail at the environment are things you should be expecting of the cloud service provider. And they should be giving you that visibility.
Yeah, I mean, do you ever get really annoyed these days when you go to shut your PC down and it says, Windows is installing 4 of 9 updates, and you've got to sit there for 5 minutes or, I don't know, 35 minutes. You need to sit there for a number of minutes while this sort of thing happens. You probably didn't notice there's actually there's a little icon which sort of suggests that you can shut down without doing the updates if you want to, and wait for the next time there's convenience. But that is the result of a thing called Windows Update. Automatically updates your machine, tries to keep it up to the latest state for things like security patches. Now, why did that come about? Well, it came about because there were a whole bunch of things that happened. Do you remember things like worms and the Sasa virus and all of those things that happened? I guess, what was that, 5, 6, 7 years ago, something like that, resulted in a little bit of inconvenience that we all have to live with now to make sure that our systems are up to date and that process is automated. So if you transfer that to the cloud, what are we beginning to see? Why was that a problem? It was really a problem because Microsoft was seen as a target by people who wanted to have fun, have fun making a name for themselves. I was the person that wrote that worm that made me famous. Yeah, it was me. Yeah, you heard it here. So what we have now is this situation where large numbers of customers congregate in one place, which is a cloud operator's data center. So it means that if you're in that kind of, that I'll call them evil, if you're in that evil community that wants to make a name for itself out of doing some damage, then you only need to attack one place. You attack the one place where all the customers are, and you'll get a lot of news. You'll hit the mainstream news if you do something where there are maybe 1,000 customers hosted in that data center. So those are the kinds of things that Microsoft, and I know that all the other cloud operators are doing this, are building intelligent systems that look at the data as it comes into the data center and says, is that an attack that's going on, or is that valid? Is that an attack, or is that valid? And this is something which is being continuously updated. The interesting thing about it, of course, is that it's more timely to protect because the cloud operators will see more of these threats. They'll see more of these things happening than you could possibly see in your own data center. And it might take months for something like that to filter down into your own data center, whereas a data center owned by a huge cloud operator with hundreds of thousands of servers, they can see all of these attacks coming in. They can compare it with what's happening in the industry, what's happening in their other data centers, build defenses against them. And so you're probably well placed to be protected against those attacks. But the question that I kind of ask is, but are those attacks more likely as a result of cloud computing in the first place? I don't know the answer to that yet, but I think it's just an interesting thing to think about for the future.
So in that regard, I suspect they are more likely. Certainly what we've seen in terms of attack models currently is if there's a concentration of value someplace, those are definitely the places that are being targeted. So for example, in the US, the attack on Lockheed Martin that happened in April was very much because they had a large volume of important defense information that made them attractive as a place of attack. So I think Planky's point is exactly true, that the attractiveness of large volumes of information will make cloud service providers an important attack vector. However, that's mitigated by what are the mechanisms that make them difficult to attack. And the more that an environment like Microsoft Azure, for example, actually does really aggressive inspection to try to find attacks before they do any damage, the less likely they'd be attacked, even with important volumes of information. So in working with a cloud service provider, it's very important to ask about their models for detecting attacks. Antivirus is important as hygiene, but it is increasingly only one of a broad range of capabilities, especially analytic capabilities, as Planky mentioned, that really are necessary to find problems before they result in extrusion of information, for example.
I'll keep going.
Okay. With respect to the perception, ill-informed or otherwise, that the cloud is less secure than the data center equivalent, which is certainly a feel that I get from prospective customers. What single thing can vendors, suppliers, the industry do that can restore faith and confidence in the use of cloud computing? Probably falling short of incarcerating all potential hackers.
As a salesperson, when my customers ask me that very question, what I'll quite often do is talk about the existing customers that I have that are in their line of work and talk through the levels of risk and due diligence that they'll have undertaken with us as a business. Of course, when you're selling to a customer, you need to back that up, so quite often understanding the contract side of the business, how secure your data is, where it's stored, and then asking all the questions that are relevant to that becomes very, very important. On the face of it, cloud computing and some vendors are able to put up a very pretty internet site and be easy to get hold of, but actually the substance behind what they deliver needs to be tested. So you should be able to test and understand fully what they're providing and make sure they can deliver what they promise.
I think one of the key things that I see, if I go back 5 years ago, I was assessing application service providers. I was assessing outsourcers, but we didn't have the actual transparency in the vendors. I don't believe that cloud is any more or less secure than what organizations are currently doing. I actually believe that the word secure is the wrong word to be using it because it gives the impression that there's an absolute that you can achieve. We actually need to see this slightly more, a slightly finer level of granularity within that. And that we actually do need to explain to the organizations, and I'm reiterating a point I made about 5 minutes ago, what are your risks? You know your information. You know, not just from a confidentiality aspect, but also an integrity and availability aspect. Where are the risks there? Because I believe that this focus on cloud, and yes, it's been great because it started discussion, but it isn't the be-all and end-all. There are current data centers out there that are not deemed to be cloud that are as much of a problem, and I don't think you can show me one cloud vendor that's fully in the cloud. It's as simple as that. The supply chain needs to be more transparent. We need to be able to be able to compare a mom-and-pop operation, as it's called in the States, who actually hold hard copy records, along with Google. Because, I mean, quite simply, just now we have this erroneous perception that cloud vendors are more secure. I don't think they're more secure, they're more aware, they're better informed. And quite often they have better security, but that also leads to somebody who could use an Amazon Web Service, for example, and not realise that they're responsible for securing their own systems because of the hype that the CSPs are actually putting out. So there is a balance, but we need more transparency in that supply chain across the board.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think Rashmi may have put up that equation, trust is equal to control plus visibility. I'm not sure. Yeah, she did. So from speaking from a cryptographic point of view, there are two ways to develop trust. One is you have an authority, a certificate authority, for example. You trust some authority who says, I know and you can trust me. Well, in fact, that model is not great anyway, but especially in cloud, it's probably not a model that's going to work. The other model is you negotiate trust, and that's very much the visibility model. My sense as well is that the most critical thing in terms of establishing trust in the cloud is that transparency, that ability to say, these are the things we think are important, and you as a cloud service provider has to provide the visibility at the individual CSP level and across the industry to demonstrate that in fact you do provide those kind of capabilities and that they're actually working. I think if that transparency were there, it would go a very large way towards establishing that kind of trust. And I honestly don't see any other way to do that. For example, by means of government agencies or things like that, that would provide certification. I think those models are probably not ones that would work.
Yeah, I have to say I agree with that. I think this is something a little bit like the positive feedback loop where success breeds success breeds success. So the more successful applications we see in the cloud that aren't subject to security issues, the more confidence customers get, the more likely they are to put their applications in the cloud, the more success we get. And so the whole thing is one of those sort of self-fulfilling cycles. I think the thing that we really need to do is just simply to wait. Now, my job as an evangelist is to persuade lots of customers that the cloud will be really good for them. And I guess all the other cloud operators have people like me, and they have salespeople who do that as well, which I think will accelerate that whole thing. But I don't think we can do anything really more to convince, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. I really love that phrase because, it's like when you're being told that something's going to be good for you, how often do you believe it? Jump off the bridge, it's going to be great. Yeah, right. But I think that's what we're really waiting for, is we're just waiting for a few more success stories and for it to become a little bit more normal, and then for that whole, the tipping point, that whole tipping point thing to take off.
I think it does also tie back to the standards question, though. I think it makes a huge difference to have, for example, the CSA guidance that gives you a model for what you should expect of the CSP and be able to apply that against them. I think the more that those kinds of frameworks and standards are accepted and developed, the more we have the basis for that kind of trust through saying to the CSP, this is what you need to do, this is what you need to provide us evidence about.
Okay, I think closing off on that question, I think one of the key things to remember here is we're entering the era of iCloud. And I think that there will become more acceptance at clouds there. We're seeing the MySpace generation coming into employment. My twins who are 5, they're using an iPad now. It's going to be seen as being more and more acceptable, but I also think that without the underlying fabric, it could lead to complacency again, because our access management is totally outdated for this era of web. Username and password is totally ineffectual. And I think that's what we're going to see have to change as well.
I have a question with regards to the legal aspect of things, in terms of throughout the whole morning, what we kept seeing was the same issues cropping up in terms of data protection and the like across a number of countries. What can the various organisations do in terms of trying and mobilise that on an international level, given that we've now got globalisation, we've got sharing of disparate breakup of service through different countries and different types of things like that. Is there anything that's being done on that, or is it all being reliant on the various client supplier relationships to deal with that?
Great question. As a salesperson trying to sell to multinationals, I can tell you that it's not an easy one to answer. I think in the circumstances of customers I've worked with where the need for that sort of contract and negotiation has been around, the fact is you need to work very, very closely, obviously, with different teams, and quite often you can come to a bit of a stalemate. You quite often can't agree everything. And at some point, as a vendor, you will simply have to pull out or say it's the way it is. I think these guys can probably answer on a more broad spectrum, but from a salesperson's perspective, it's quite often very, very hard to get that bit right.
Yeah, thanks. I think one of the key things here is law hasn't really caught up with technology. I mean, when I did my master's about 5 years ago, I looked at the Computer Misuse Act, and I actually saw that the legal definition of theft resulted in the Computer Misuse Act because law would not change. I believe in some ways there's too much being done to create new laws and not enough to actually take the current legal fabric of all organisations, of all countries, into this century, to be fair. I believe that we have a Data Protection Act which, in my experience, is wholly misunderstood, even within so-called data protection laws within organisations. I can run rings with them and I should not be able to do that. And I think that part of the problem as well is the hacking legislation, etc. In the US, in the UK, it's based on trespass. US, it's based more on the fraudulent aspect. This notion of privacy is just starting to come through in some countries. But yet, we've talked about, we need a legal fabric for the cloud. What about data protection? In cloud vendors, yet we have, how many call centres do we have over in India? I mean, that's nothing against Indians, but it's quite simply, this cloud has sensationalised far too much. And this is the reason why I firmly believe that we need to go back to the information and simply look at where the risks are to it. And then we'll work that through in the contractual obligations, because that's all it is at the end of the day. It's just a digital representation of words.
So I've just moved from the US to Switzerland. My wife's a Swiss. And it has certainly brought into focus very different cultural attitudes about what privacy is and what security is. It's not an accident, I think, that the European privacy laws are very different from US privacy laws, and that the behavior in the US around privacy is very different from the behavior at least in Switzerland, with regard to privacy. There are really important cultural differences around what it means to secure your own information and secure other people's information that are reflected in the laws currently, and that I think actually do make it difficult to reach common understanding about what are the right models for privacy and security, and what are the right ways to apply technology to it. So I don't wish to be pessimistic about it, but I think it's a difficult problem, and one that it may be necessary to begin in the standards arena, for example, with organizations that are not government-based, that allow you to look at the technology problems and begin working at that level, and gradually over time affect the legislative issues. I was approached by colleagues in Germany who say that there is an initiative there now to relook at some of the privacy laws there because of the issues around restriction of movement of German information across boundaries that make it very difficult to embrace cloud vendors who allow that movement even within the European community. So there may be some movement in that direction, but I honestly would, out of personal experience now, feel that there's a lot of work to be done to achieve that, and it's not simply a question of negotiation.
Yeah, this reminds me a bit of all the dialogue that there was around the European Directive on Digital Signatures There was this, I've forgotten what it's called now, what's the, man from RSA will know, where you digitally sign a document and what's it called? Non-repudiation. Non-repudiation. So, this document has been signed by you, it cannot be repudiated. And what happens when it gets to court is that is taken along with other evidence. So there is a body of evidence of which that is one part of it. And there's lots of other evidence, and somebody will make a decision based on the body of evidence, not just that one piece of information. So when you look at all the individual laws, each of those individual laws is really a container for a piece of evidence among lots of other pieces of evidence. So when something goes wrong, we're not really just looking at one law. We're usually looking at lots of things that have happened to determine, who is to blame, what the process is, what the remediation should be.
I think one final point I would make there as well. Up at the NIST conference this year in Edinburgh, so St Andrews, Stuart Room, who's one of the top lawyers in the country, he actually stated that most data protection court cases were based on negligence, on the law of negligence. Technology and the focus on technology, I actually do believe, unfortunately, technology changes. And as long as the technologists continue to innovate without managing identified risks, that I do fear that, because I do fear that you're never going to get common ground.
Mark, do you have any extra points you'd like to add to that? There'll be one behind you.
I'm afraid that there is quite a lot of work going on in the background of the Data Protection Directive, and it's not only Germany that chasing it, but I fear the absolute worst, because by Christmas we'll probably have an idea of what's going to happen. But I suspect we'll soon be having to appoint data protection officers in every business, pretty much nailed on certainty. We're talking about regulation next time, so that will be automatically implemented in every European country without the ability of the local jurisdiction to vary the law or be a little bit more sympathetic. So the UK, which has always done its best to help businesses a little bit with European directives, will be overruled by Europe. We'll see some more stringent legislation. And we're also seeing data breach notification coming through, which means if you lose the data, you're going to have to policy and process, and you have to go through and notify everyone involved and go through another process. So it is being looked at. There's an awful lot of lobbying going on, and I've been involved in some of that lobbying. I've seen a lot of the other lobbying, and businesses are doing an awful lot to try and stop it. But so far, there hasn't been a lot of success in that regard. So come 2012, we've got quite a change coming.
Is that based on the fact that the legal team are doing it on their own, or are they actually involving the people within the industry?
There's a lot. There's some serious campaigning going on from some of the big guys. I know people like Microsoft and others. There's open letters, there's lobbying. The problem is the law was really conceived in 85, brought together in 90. And at that point, international data transfers were batch file A to B. There was no on transfer. And ever since, nobody's even caught up. So we're in a position where there's an awful lot to be done. Perhaps on international transfers, we might see some relaxation. But with cloud, you need a whole new category of data controller, the dumb process or something like that people are lobbying for. But you saw what's happened with cookies. We've seen that that's disabling businesses at the moment in the e-commerce space. And that's a situation where it's been implemented, half of Europe hasn't implemented it. I think it's going to be an awful lot worse. So, the only other thing I can say is practicality. I think a lot of clients come to us these days and say, I don't want to know the speed of it, I want to know how fast I can drive. And if you think about that, it's not, lawyers are very good at saying, this is the law, this is what we must do, but a lot of this, people are making a judgment about, they're making their own determination about what is adequate, and they're pushing ahead anyway. And it's just going down to how you mitigate risk and show that you at least contemplated it, because if you hadn't contemplated it, you could be in serious trouble, but at least if you can say, I've done this, all the better.
So there's an interesting perspective on that from the US. In 2004, California passed Senate Bill 1386. That was the first data privacy law passed in the US. And there was certainly a great deal of fighting against that. But the immediate effect when it was passed was actually to inspire some major new technologies that allowed detection of certain classes of important information more readily than you could do prior to that, data loss prevention technologies. And so it can actually happen that legislative changes may foster innovation in areas that enable new ways to deal with protection of information, like DLP, for example. Certainly, it can happen the other way. Facebook, for example, raised a whole different class of privacy issues than what we'd had before, through the issues around the movement of that information across the Facebook infrastructure. But I think it is important that we as technologists may well be able to, in response to legislation, for example, provide mechanisms that give better governance, better visibility, better ability to understand where the information is, and to take that as our responsibility across the technological companies.
I think there's 2 points. First of all, certainly the technologists that I know are not particularly good at governance, unfortunately. But also when you're with what you were talking about there, if I was a CIO, I'd be really, really scared if I didn't have a clue what information was in my organisation. We've got big data, we've had all these different things there. Organisations are kicking back on this because they see their information the same way when they had big filing cabinets and physical security was enough. There is huge financial benefit to be gained from understanding the information that you have in the risk and managing the risk to it. That does not mean to say you don't do anything. Risk comes from the Latin risicare, it means to dare. Risks are not there to be feared, they're there to actually to be managed to achieve things. And I think that we've become too negative in our view of risks to information over the years. And this compliance risk management nature where we currently find security of being, what's good enough? Just what can I do? Well, I'm sorry guys, if you do that, you're going to spend more and more money year on year, and if I was a CIO, you might as well just go and burn £200,000 in hard cash in your car park, because it's going to do you no more benefit. It'll keep the lawyers happy, all due respect, sorry. But I believe that the lawyers now also need to stand up and stop being philosophers and actually start becoming advisors on some of this and work with it. Going back to what Stuart Room said, he said in the UK alone there's 120 security organisations, security associations. They need to meet together to actually come up with what's going on. I dread to think how many organisations we have globally that have got cloud in the name. But I think that we're seeing the same. I mean, this is information. I know I'm reiterating the point here, but businesses are fearful because they don't understand this beast that they have called the IT department. That's what, and I firmly believe that's what all of this has led us to.
Another comment, sorry. So, I think given compliance issues, at EMC RSA, our sense is the only way to deal with this issue is actually to look at not the compliance as the driver, but to look at how you're governing the enterprise as the driver in terms of security. That if you try to do it in terms of all of the legislations, regulations, directives, you'll find yourself chasing those so much that you actually will never be able to achieve the compliance you're after. And so instead what we at EMC do, in fact, and strongly recommend, is a kind of governance cycle in which you pay attention first to what the risks are and how you want to manage those and design your security program based on the risk profile and the models you have for security, not on compliance, and take compliance as an outcome of the security program. One way that's feasible is if the vendors like ourselves actually map into the governance tools the outputs that show where you are relative to those laws. If they don't do that, then you still have all the burden of the compliance reporting. But if tools that deal with governance do the mapping to say, here's where the gaps are, here's what you need to think about, often, in EMC's case, it's absolutely true. We use that in our work with auditors to say, here's our program, here's where we are, this is what's driving us, and even if we have some gaps in compliance, we're able to say, those are part of what we're addressing over time, and so are not at fault in the compliance. So, at least from our own experience at EMC, would strongly urge that you think about the compliance model as one that's part of a governance cycle rather than something to address on a piece-by-piece basis.
Okay, so another question we've been asked is, how can those adopting the cloud actually ensure that their data is safe?
I don't know. How can you ensure that your data... Well, I mean, the thing is that you can't ensure that your data is safe when it's in somebody else's data center, in the same way that you can't ensure that it's safe when it's in your own data center. So the only thing that you can do is meet your obligations for developing secure applications and protecting the data in the ways that you would do in your own data center, according to some good governance and good standards and so on. And then trust that the data center operator that is running your cloud service for you does their part of the deal. But I really don't think that you can come up with any guarantees. And the reason for this is because nobody realizes that there's a security hole until somebody finds it. And, can you really say to yourself that you're going to find all the security holes in all the systems that are operating before anybody under the label evil does? And I think probably not. So I don't think you can absolutely guarantee it. All you can do is you can put in the best measures possible, take the experience of the cloud operators who have they have great levels of experience because of the amount of data and the volume of applications that they're looking after, and just trusting that they'll do the right things.
So at EMC, I'll repeat a little bit of what we talked about. At EMC, we did actually outsource our HR applications. And the experience there is that the only way we could manage the risk around that was, on the one hand, to negotiate with the cloud service provider about what controls, what mechanisms we expected them to have in place, and then how they would give us visibility into what they actually were doing. It was not, for us, feasible to just trust that they would actually do what they said they would do. We had to have some way to get attestations, affirmations, evidence that said, this is actually where you're doing encryption, this is where you're doing access control, this is how you're doing segmentation of information, this is how you're doing management of our employee access into your environment. All of that specification of the model that they were putting in place, we had to negotiate, and then once we negotiated, had to negotiate how we got back the evidence that it was actually working. My sense is that if you want to entrust things to a cloud service provider, you'll probably have to do something like that as well. We're actually working with a vendor with a company who is planning to use Azure, and I know, in fact, there are very deep negotiations between Microsoft and that company exactly in this same area of what are you putting in place for controls for our information, and how can we know that that's actually working? I think that's the only model. As you said, Planky, it's not a guarantee. For example, we at RSA really believed that it would be impossible for someone to breach us. We've got a black eye. But nonetheless, the more of that cycle you put in place, the higher the probability is that you actually will achieve secure information, and at least then you can mitigate the risks. For example, in the HR case, we had clauses in the contract about liability for data exposure, for example. So it was not only a technology or process, it was also a financial agreement related to liability around our information.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with the comments before. For an SMB or a small enterprise, we'll have to kind of revert back to some good old-fashioned security questions as well, I think, so that actually means something to you. And that'll be things like, how does the vendor go about delivering their penetration testing? What third-party validation do they have around, their own vulnerabilities? And if you're asking questions like that and you get very little in the way of objective feedback, that either people are hiding behind smoke and mirrors, or whether it's something that's very, very real and deliverable as a business, and they're living and breathing, the high levels of security every day. Otherwise, it's back to good old-fashioned trust and the fact that other people are doing it.
Well, simply, there is no safe, there is no secure. The reason I'll say that is because when a client interacts with any external service provider, there's a relationship. And there's a relationship that gets undertaken when you operate controls. And I'll give an example. Any cloud service provider can provide you with a fantastic leading-edge host system. If you stick your own application on that, and you don't ensure that your own code has been tested, has been assessed, who's responsible for the breach of your information through a SQL injection attack? Not them. But I continually see organizations that I go into actually just asking, okay, do you do all these things? Yes, we do. Happy days, you're secure. Sorry, it's a fallacy. Internal organizations as well are using the current compliance risk management to lie to their organizations to tell them that they're safe and secure to justify the budgets. I'm sorry, guys. You ain't safe, you ain't secure. Fair enough, you're secure in your own job, but you're paying an awful lot of money for very little benefit. And I think that until organizations understand that there is that relationship between a client and a provider, whether it be cloud or not, you're never going to manage risk, and it goes back to risk management. And until we get this word called security out of our heads and realize it is all about the risk management, it is all about the governance, as you have already talked about, rather than the pure technology, then nothing is going to improve. And we need transparency, but that isn't going to get that. And I think that if we go back to the Data Protection Act, Principle 7 isn't just appropriate organizational, technical, blah, blah. It also states within Principle 7 that you've got to undertake due diligence. What it doesn't state is what that due diligence should be. And I think that that's somewhere where we need to look at this co-joining of the assurance frameworks, as has been talked about already, to actually ensure that we get something that's going to tell us where our perception gap lies. And that simply is not there at the present minute in time.
Any other questions?
I might add to that one other. I was recently talking to an analyst in Germany, a fellow named Martin Küppinger, who's part of Küppinger & Kohl, and he made the point that in looking at using a cloud service provider, for example, one of the most important technological issues to look at is their ability to change technologies if there's a need to. For example, with authentication, the ability to have a user prove that they are who they say they are. Often that's done just with username and password, but there are a broad range of technologies, from challenge questions to two-factor authentication, all of which can be used. And it's very important in negotiating with a cloud service provider, not only to reach agreement about which of those they'll use, but also to understand how adaptable they are in terms of being able to move from one to another. For example, as your requirements change and you decide that for this particular application, what had been adequate with username and password now does require at least additional challenge questions. So in looking at these questions of trust, part of it is also, I think, a level of not just visibility, but of the capabilities that the service provider themselves is able to support that allow you that flexibility in terms of dealing with security issues, recognizing that security, the problems you face, is a moving target and will change over time. And you need to have that flexibility in the provider in order to respond to changing conditions.
You like I'm hogging this. Okay, I have one more question. In terms of the presentations again this morning, one of the issues that came out was understanding your data, understanding it in a totally different way to how people currently use it in terms of the identification, classification, etc., etc. In terms of the standards that you have and stuff, does that actually address that as part of the approach to when you're considering going on to a cloud?
So to speak out personally in terms of EMC, absolutely. So with the movement of our stuff to the third party that we use, the HR cloud service provider, there were two major things that we did. Inside EMC, we used a data loss prevention tool to understand where that information was across our environment. There was a great deal of concern that, in fact, before we could be sure we were entrusting the right stuff to a third party, we actually had to understand what we had ourselves. And so part of that was an a priori classification. These are the kind of data we know we have in our systems. But there was also a discovery process that said, is this actually all that we have in those systems? Do we know where it is across the environment? And that classification really required both the kind of traditional classification model of making your decisions based on what you know about the information, but of also going out and finding what had happened inside IT that perhaps hadn't been as planned. And those two things together were then encapsulated inside, in our case, the rules that we gave to the cloud service provider about what information we would or wouldn't entrust to them, what was transient information, what was persistent information, and how they would protect those classes of information as they worked with it. For example, things like hire date, birth date, salary, all of that persistent information had to be stored on encrypted hardware, so that if you pulled the hardware and sent it to repurposed, the vendor couldn't look at it, including EMC. But things like the intermediate salary reviews, those were only in a single location and were deleted after that work was done. So we had specific requirements based on the transients and persistent, based on the kind of information, based on the use of information, and so on. And that was both a technology problem, but was also very much a classification issue.
Yeah, we have this model inside Microsoft which talks about the business impact of the loss or leakage of information. So we actually use Windows Azure for a lot of our internal systems. And the sort of thing I can tell you is, for example, employee HR data and our crown jewels, our source code, that does not live in Windows Azure. But when you consider the vast majority, absolutely gigabytes and terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of data that nobody really cares about. If I look at my laptop, I was talking to people on my table about this. My laptop's got a 500 gig hard drive in it. There's probably got 300 gigabytes of videos, presentations, PowerPoint slides, Word documents, that kind of stuff. And, I saw there's video cameras here today. I possibly will end up with that on my machine, but who really cares about that? And my drive gets synchronized to a service that we have inside Microsoft. Really, who really cares about that? So that's pretty low impact. The loss of that information or the leakage of that information is fairly low impact. But our source code, the leakage of our source code could have material impact on our business. And that's where we make that distinction. So it's more on the business impact of the data, or the loss or leakage of that data. What will its impact be on the business once the awful thing has happened?
I think if you're asking the question, do assurance frameworks cover it? Yes, they say, do you have one? With the CAM hat on, we run a hybrid quantitative qualitative model for that specific control. There's 5 levels. Do I actually believe that more needs to be done? Yes, because I heard last year that security is where health and safety was back in the 70s. If we take that analogy further, risk management is back in the 20s. We've forsaken risk management properly for technological shiny, and that concerns me. I've worked in a range of public and private sector organisations and who have used different business impact levels. I see an awful lot of security functions or technical functions who believe that they understand what the impact is, and unfortunately it's not. And I've also seen clients say, well, this is no impact at all because it's not got personal data, it's not got credit card data, yet it had the custom hedging for their energy. And it's like, well, sorry, if I left this in the train, would you be worried? They don't actually realise that. When you look at the Cloud Industry Forum's research and results back, I think, May time, most people were actually happy to put their customers' data in the cloud, but not their own. And actually, if we're going back to the trust in the cloud, until Microsoft actually put their own information in there, who's going to trust it? Sorry, that's not a dig at you, but I think that this is part of the eating your own dog food. When you believe it's safe for private time, your customers will too. So in terms of impact analysis, I tend to use the CESG business impact level tables because they're actually quite useful. Obviously, some of the quantum cryptography stuff take out, and death and destruction take out, but if you actually look at a lot of it makes a lot of sense. There's actually an entire table devoted to data privacy and looks at personal data. How cool is that? And I think that is what I've got all of my clients over the past 4 years to actually use, because I've seen that's the one thing that I would take out of government that actually works. But it has to be communication. And until you engage with your business stakeholders, forget it. You do not understand what impact you have on DLP will not work until people understand what to sign as.
Yeah, just a couple of comments really. I've worked with companies small and large around different DLP projects, and pretty much every company has always found it very, very hard to go through the first phase, which I think you call discovery. Quite often IT, HR, or the business can't agree between them what's important, what isn't. So if you can get through that bit, the business could then put policies in place. And of course, if you're going to decide what you should retain or put in private or public cloud, then obviously that makes it a much easier platform to move from.
I'm conscious of time, so I'm holding the microphone. Okay, so I'm going to do 2 quick-fire questions. I only want about 10 words from each of you. 10 words. Okay, so the first one is around how do security threats differ to the mobile cloud from those to other devices?
I'll have a think about that.
So the end user is the big difference on the mobile device, right? What we found at EMC is that is still the weak point, and that will be even more so as more information is on the mobile device, and the mobile device is more mobile.
Yeah. I saw somebody on the tube, and they had an Android phone, which has probably got some data backed up in a cloud somewhere that they don't even realize that's where it is, because it certainly probably isn't on the phone if there's a lot of it. And I actually saw them do their pattern to log in, and I thought, if they left their phone on there, I would immediately know how to get access to it. So there's a real easy usability sort of risk there.
None of you learnt to count, did you, when you were small?
I won't be much better. Where do I start? 10 words. That's 5. I think on mobile cloud, you need to weigh up the risk of allowing employees access to things remotely and on the move versus being able to measure the reward on productivity and effectiveness in the business. And if you can do that, you'll know whether it's a good or bad thing for you.
Access control needs to change, and it needs to evolve for mobile devices. That's 1. Point 2, security is allegedly about CIA, but it's only ever about C. The biggest threat I see to mobile devices is the actual mobile cell falling over, and you've got business continuity aspect. Controversial, but that's part of security as well.
Okay, we'll try for 10 this one. Okay, fine. So, should security be seen as being... Oh, goodness, sorry. I sound like I've had a gin, but I haven't. Should security be seen as being as big an issue as it is currently to the cloud? Do you want me to repeat that? One more time. Should security be seen as being as big an issue as it currently is to the cloud? 10 words. I'm taking it off you.
Absolutely. It's a very big issue for the cloud.
Yes.
Mitigate risk.
No, it's not. Information risk management is far more important. Security is dead.
Thank you very much, the panel.